And welcome to this week's Practice as Research seminar. I'm quite excited because this time we've got a little bit more of an experiment. It's a slightly different version of our seminar series. Today I am in an actual gallery and I have got with me our guest speaker, Andy Ash. Andy is an artist, researcher and educator. His practice is primarily sculpture, but he's also focusing on an expansive notion of sculpture. And that's why he also includes things like film, performance, object, sound, drawing, print, text, any kind of aspect of different kinds of medium in an installation or a site-specific context. So for him, it's really all about working in the place and developing the art in that space. And that's what we're going to focus on today. He also says that collaboration and dialogue for him play a big role in his creative process, in making the work socially engaged and interdisciplinary. And really, that's the part that I'm quite fascinated by, and I'm really excited to have Andy here today in this session, which is called Practice as Research in the Studio. I'm going to hand over to Andy so that he can lead us through a presentation initially around what he thinks about practice as research, where do the things connect, or where are the links, where are the tensions. And then we're going to probably experiment a little bit with showing you some of the work that he's involved and doing at the moment in the gallery space. But obviously, there's always an opportunity for you to ask any questions and like either put them in the chat box or make yourself known to me so that we can bring you into the conversation. This is very much, as always, a presentation and then followed with discussion and conversation. So the more you're engaged, the more interesting it will be for everyone who's here and who may be catching up on YouTube or on Buzzsprout later. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to mute myself. And Andy, you can come in.
What's the mute? Okay. Okay, hello everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay, and hopefully we're going to be able to sort of move a little bit around the space behind me. So I sort of left the screen on without me in it when we first started, just so that you could get a sense of the fact that we're actually in the Art Design and Museology department at UCL. We're in the Monitor Gallery, which is a small space just off the studios, and we use this space for exhibitions and shows, end of year, etc. But also I've been using it for teaching. It's a space I use for inquiry. I use it to explore, to curate learning, and in some respects I use it not just for outcomes, but I use it as a kind of a playground. I use it as a way to sort of think, a way to explore. And so I'm going to talk today about my practice, and I think the best way to do that is by showing you my practice. And I've got things that are kind of in real time. They're things that I would say are not finished. They are mainly maquettes, they are thoughts, and what I'm trying to do is share my thinking in this practice. So what I've done is I've moved my studio temporarily to this gallery space, and I've worked in this space this week, and I'm trying to reveal for you aspects of the process of my making. I'm trying to reveal my inquiry, my research, and in doing so, I'm hoping that we can explore how I'm kind of trying to progress. I'm not sure I'm being that successful in it, in the latest kind of commission that I've managed to secure, which is at the Winter Sculpture Park, which is just off the Thamesmead estate in the east End of London, and it's with an organisation called Gallery No32. So it's a live project. So just as a quick health warning, it's far from finished. It's just where I am at this moment in the commission. And I've still got till March for the install and for the finished. So what you will be seeing today is as far as I've got in my research and in my sort of meaning making with this particular project. So what are we going to be thinking about today? I think I want to do stuff that's around the focus of your interest, which is clearly practice. I want to do stuff that tries to bring together and make coherent the idea of inquiry and research. I'm going to talk a lot, obviously, about my own practice, about art and about teaching. I'm going to sort of frame it as a kind of a journey. A lot of it is for me is about process. So it is very kind of journey orientated. And in some respects, today is a bit like going down the Alice in Wonderland hole. We're off down a rabbit hole. It's a journey that's going to be hopefully interesting to you, but may not necessarily give you lots of answers, which I think a lot of the time, that's how my work tends to be. I'm not really striving to a point of trying to achieve answers, but I can talk about that as well. My practice, what do I do? It's really a kind of a dialogue as critical practice. There's a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of taking risks. A lot of it's about knowledge production, which contributes to the teaching and learning and my own making. And I'll talk a little bit about that sort of relationship and how that sort of feeds and the synergy that exists within that. So the structure will be, I'm going to talk at the beginning and give you some context using the presentation. And then, as Nicola said, what we'll do is we'll open it up, we'll walk around the space and we'll look at the work that's present and we can perhaps ask some questions and Nicola can kind of open up for some questions. Yeah, I thought that would be nice. So the first image you see on the screen is a recent exhibition. I think it was 2023, January. I was invited to the Singapore Biennale to take part at the NIE Gallery, and it was a group show, and the theme was about creative practice as research. It was Hong Kong University, Nanyang University, Cambridge University, Royal College, and obviously myself from UCL. And it's kind of an interesting conversation about the role of being creative in research. And so I'll leave the link in the perhaps in the chat or afterwards. Nicola can send it to you, because again, there was a really interesting discussion built around a show, which is kind of a model that I use and kind of what we're doing today. So it might be helpful quickly to locate myself in this work. What's the sort of lens? Which view? I think always think that's really kind of crucial. I'm a practicing visual artist, and I find this to be core to my practice as an educator and as a researcher. I live and work in London and Brighton, and I'm an associate professor at UCL, and I teach postgrads at UCL education. And my studio is in Brighton. So mainly it's PGCE, Art and Design Secondary, Initial Teacher Education, MA in Museums and Galleries, and MA in Art Education. And I lead mainly on galleries and certainly on contemporary art practice and artists, contemporary artists in education, which is kind of relevant to obviously what you're going to see and what I do. And I do some supervision on the ED, and previously I've worked in international teacher training and obviously consultancy. And I was just joking with Nicola. I'm also, for one of my other kind of hats that I wear, for the last 21 days, I'm officially the president of the National Society for Education in Art and Design, which is a learned society for artists and art educators. So what is the kind of nature of my work? So I suppose there's two interwoven strands to the practice as an artist, as a researcher, and as a teacher. Number one, art education, visual art practice as research and making. Number two, transdisciplinarity, collaboration, and as I said, a dialogic approach. Now, these kind of form the sort of basis of also how I make. So I trained as a fine art in sculpture, and I tend to make more installation-based kind of in situ installation based sort of works. They tend to be sometimes with making with objects, sometimes using objects, sometimes prints, drawings, sometimes performance, photography and film. And today in the sort of maquette versions and in the sort of in progress versions, you'll see all of those things. I think most of those sort of things are probably in this sort of process today. So I'm influenced by some great artist teachers, people like John Baldessari, Joseph Beuys, all conceptual art, the relationship between the meaning, the making, the learning and the ideas being sort of central and key. And on the slide that you see now, it's a recent piece made during the Artist Teacher Network that I run in London, out of the Freelands Foundation in Chalk Farm, where you can see artist teachers come together to support each other personally and professionally in their sort of their own development, in their own practice development. And I really liked the piece, a piece that John Baldessari made in the 70s, which was picked up by his students and written all over the studio walls of the studio in California. And I sort of made my own version of it. And you can see the one in blue is mine and the one behind is his. I will not make any more boring art teachers, as a kind of a nice mantra. And I think it's quite interesting that somebody interjected, somebody interjected and then wrote artist teachers in it for me, which I thought was really nice. But it's kind of a homage and a kind of I think in some way, a kind of an interesting sort of start point to think about the practice. The Freeland Foundation is an interesting space for me. It brings together my practice, the teaching. It's a community of practice. Again, a theme that runs through the work, where we support and develop each other, where we explore, where we inquire, and we think about the relationship between our making and our teaching. And that's kind of on a sort of a continuum. For some people, and in others, they're a bit more polar and separate, or distinct and separate. And for me, I kind of synergize them as a part. So I advocate for the importance of that relationship to making art and making meaning, making understanding. This is a kind of fundamental to me, not just the material or a process like, I am a painter, I am a ceramicist because I use clay. That's not really the sort of the basis of where I start. It's more about the meaning making. And again, somebody like Joseph Beuys talks about these relationships, these dynamics, and I think it's good as a good port of call for non-artists to think about or to explore, because he talked about what the sense of it is to be an artist teacher. And he's associated with a term called social sculpture. Again, something I think is really an interesting term, where he sort of developed a theory designed to, back in the 70s, I think it was, based on the concept that everything is art, that every aspect of life could be approached creatively. And as a result, everyone has the potential to be an artist. And that kind of resonates and is kind of interesting, because I think about my own teaching as a creative act, as a creative process, as a work of art in the same sort of way. So social sculpture united Joseph Beuys' idealistic, I suppose, ideas of a utopian society with his aesthetic practice. And he believed that life is a social sculpture, that everybody can shape it. Okay, yeah. So let me just talk a little bit about my understanding as an artist, because I think that opens up then some of the sorts of themes that kind of resonate then with the kind of research. So I think I play many roles. Often I've written about this, which is kind of an important part of my research profile, but they link the slide you see, for instance, kind of helps sort of think about academically how I sort of position and how I can sort of fruitfully engage with this. So the artist is educator. I use the gallery space for learning and relate that to my own work. Hence, why we're here today in this space for this kind of dialogue. All of these things kind of facilitate the projects facilitation as a practice. So as an educator, I engage with learners primarily through discussion and through exchanging of ideas and experiences. And I suppose simply that's kind of co-construction or co-constructivist sort of theories about how learning takes place. whereby we share sort of shared knowledge is generated, and the artist functions as a kind of a co-learner rather than the knowledge being transmitted and the artist being in this sort of expert position or being seen as in that role with participants. So the artist can also provide experiential learning, which is with an emphasis on giving participants the opportunity to experiment with in a supportive environment. So I see myself doing a lot of that as an educator. I sort of frame how I use that creatively as well as a part of my practice. But also artists as a collaborator. Often I work with others, other artists, other academics, scientists, the public, participants in making meaning and in the making. And I think artists recognise the value and the importance of this kind of collaboration within projects. But I'm obviously aware that that's not always possible or sometimes desirable. So the key issues there to include, I suppose, to the extent to which a kind of an artist retains control over the process and the final products and then the final ownership. And when we think about research, sometimes that can be an area of contention and something that has to be negotiated and sort of thought through kind of quite carefully so that you can think about the dynamic and the relationship in terms of collaborative making. So I suppose this is kind of a question then, for maybe a bit later on about roles in this. But I also see myself as a role model for other artists and for other educators. And I think that sort of comes out in, and I'll talk a little bit about that, in the networks that I think are really important to my practice and really important to the development of inquiry and research. I belong to a number of sorts of organisations and places and spaces for different sorts of reasons. So I think, as I mentioned, I embody sort of a kind of a critical and a conceptual problem-solving kind of approach to making art. I use the word inquiry, and that kind of helps when I think about making art. And this is the how and the why I perceive and how I perhaps engage with sort of participants in the same way. I like to engage with others, collaborators, and I also see that in my position I have a role as a kind of a mentor or a role model with students and maybe with other artists. And so there's this kind of interplay between the idea of, I suppose, exemplifying a profound level of engagement with my own practice. You know, I practice what I preach, I do it. There's a kind of a demonstrating, a second level of a particular working method and a critical and a creative approach to that, which I think is kind of important for young artists. And thirdly, I kind of embody the concept of what it kind of might look like if you're reasonably successful and that you're reasonably sort of able to sort of show regularly. And that sort of pedagogical model of, I suppose, would have previously been a sort of apprenticeship model. I feel I have a responsibility as an artist to support other artists. So that's why that kind of role model feels like a role in the things that I do. But I'm also kind of interested in the artist as a social activist, the sort of political issue-based dimension of the work, how I consider sort of responsibility to sort of think about and draw attention to social and political issues, and to enable participants to articulate some of those issues that might be important to them and the group. And I think often artists can give voice to participants and encourage that kind of broader, critical and reflective sort of thinking. I belong to something called a socially engaged practice network, which is UK based, but I belong to the Brighton base. And we collaborate and research and show together regularly. And the last sort of major thing we did was at the Bath Festival in June, I think it was. So then there's the last section. It's interesting. I've spent sort of quite a lot of my time talking about all these others, and yet the last section is researcher and inquirer. And thinking about that sort of academic and artistic work, thinking about how artists have acquired these skills and knowledge through their own education, through their own practice, through their own individual creativity and experiences. And in many respects, it's kind of interesting because there's no set career path for something like this for us to follow. So that kind of relationship between the individual artist's creative practice, their collaborative nature or ventures, community, based sort of complexities, and keeping all of these activities is a way of, I think is a really important way of combining them. And each of them, I think, yeah, helps with what I would call like engaging in a process of inquiry. So I've just come through a second stage of a more of an environmental sort of proposal that I've been putting together for a piece that will go up on the South Downs National Park in Sussex. And I think that's kind of interesting for me because it's a way of, I've been sort of thinking about ways of engaging with the local community in the sort of Sussex countryside in the borders of Brighton, but also with farming and with farmers and with a lot of environmental issues that are related to do that. I thought I'd outline for those of you that might be interested in some of the kind of texts or influential people that I've used in the past that help with the thinking, to help with that kind of conceptual overview of the practice and how I feel they support some of these things about collaboration in my practice. And some of these you may be familiar with, some of you may be specialists in these sorts of areas as well, and some they may be less. But I'm going to offer perhaps this idea of the concept, the brief discussion of kind of the concept of artful inquiry and practice, and how these concepts as research, as models for research, can be generative. And I'm going to raise a few questions perhaps as well as we go through and think about strategies, how cross-disciplinary boundaries of art and science and education, and in my case, walking, how they kind of work and relate. Obviously, I'm maybe going to touch upon a little bit about exhibition operating as kind of a hosted space for display and for conversation, and how that functions for me to engage in and therefore generate dialogue between myself, artists and others, whether that's scientists. I've done a lot of work with neuroscientists and academics, whether that be in education and teachers, but that kind of almost like generating transdisciplinarity. So that sort of Foucaultian notion of conversations I've used around sort of some of these themes around brain, around consciousness, about ways of seeing and ways of being. And I might be able to get to reflect on some of those kind of things and how they perhaps generate knowledge, multiple perspectives, and thus maybe even unanticipated knowledge. So some of the key people you'll see on the screen, some of the texts and the ideas, I might flag 2 or 3 of them for you. But I use art making in my research and teaching, and I use Irvin and de Cossen as a kind of a rich. They talk about a rich relationship and meaningful relationships, and I think that's kind of interesting. And I've got one text called Artography, which I'll come back to, which fits in that sort of area of art and making. Visual art practice and research is a kind of Sullivan is a kind of a really key text. It's kind of 101 MA. It's the one sort of thing that we use straight from the off. And this explores themes around practice and the idea of contexts of inquiry. Okay, context of inquiry. And I think Sullivan is a really nice example for those that are not sort of too sure about how do we do these things and how do we kind of, what would we be using. Right, she just flagged. I need to skip on a bit quicker, so I'll just flag. So this is a kind of an interesting text. It's kind of an edited text. Rita Irwin from Canada, from can't remember the name of the university, but I think that what's really interesting about that is you get lots of little case studies of how you can explore and use the visual arts to help with representation, to help with educational research. And it's kind of a unique way of kind of thinking about different artists contributing, primarily talking about their own practice and their research. That was the Sullivan that I mentioned. A really good sort of, again, strategies and approaches to plan and think about delivering visual art research for those of you that might not have seen. Rose and Pink, they're quite helpful. Again, it's 101 sort of, I suppose, undergrad in some respects, because these are kind of indispensable for me, because they help us, anybody that's working with visual materials, anybody that's working with theory orientated around this sort of approach, how to interpret visual culture, how to sort of think about using archival material, etc. Really useful texts. And the Pink's particularly good for interdisciplinary and post-disciplinary kind of practices. And then the last one is Wenger. Sometimes it's Etienne, Wenger, and Lav. But again, this is really useful for collaborative work, thinking about that sort of relationship, how you locate your sort of principle of coming together, how professionals can can work and support and develop together. So there's some of the sort of recent exhibitions, and you can see sort of I try to do 2 or 3 exhibitions a year, local, national, and international. You can have a look on my website. I'll put a link at the end. Kind of gives you a kind of a flavour of the sort of places. Some of these are residency based. Some of these are kind of individual, and some of them are more kind of group. There's a kind of a breakdown of the sorts of collaborations and the sorts of kind of themes, and I'll just leave those I'll leave those hanging because I'm conscious of time. But I think really just to flag that I've done a lot of work around sort of consciousness and dialogues between artists and scientists, and this is a rather lovely guy, Professor Anil Seth at Sussex University, who very kindly agreed to help me with my own brain. And in the background, you can see there's actually an animation of my own brain flying through my own brain. I did an MRI scan and stitched them all together to make this kind of interesting sort of fly through my brain. But I also recorded my brain thinking. So I isolated the electro sort of magnetic sort of sounds of my brain thinking, and you put it through a kind of a really interesting interface, and it'll turn the electricity, the little sparking of moments, into a sound. So I'll play a little bit of that, which I thought was kind of interesting. So there's some of the sort of places I've worked. There's some of the sorts of residencies. There's some of the sorts of themes, and I'll perhaps. And then, as I said, some of the collaborations, which I think have been really useful and important in the past. And they range from, again, local right through to national and international. I think that's been a really important part of the making. Okay, so should we open it up for a look around the gallery and a few questions? I've shown this text because people were asking, well, there's multiple ways that I research. Some of it is, the practice, the exhibition is a research output, but I also write, and I also use that sort of to inform. And so the last book came out in when was April, which was like thinking about how we can teach a more contemporary curriculum, how we can engage with issues based around teaching, how we can sort of look at themes that teachers are struggling with, like decolonizing, anti-ableism, curating, etc., etc. So there's a kind of a link there. Okay, I'm going to stop, and we're going to have a little look.
Thank you.
In the gallery.
Thank you very much, Andy. This is great. I'm obviously joining Andy on his Zoom now. This is to make sure that we don't have any interference and feedback. You staying with me, Andy, because I really would like you to show us what you've got in the gallery, what your work in progress is, and maybe you were able to tell us, that because you said earlier that you are on one hand a researcher, but you're also an educator, an artist. Where do you draw the lines, or what are these pieces? How do you define them? I know you don't like these questions, but I think it's quite important that we get that.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm holding the microphone and the camera at the same time, so we can see this space. So as I said, so thinking about those kinds of definitions. Well, I don't really see them as being separate entities. I see the sort of work, I see the teaching, I see my practice all being quite symbiotic. And so for me to do this today has been an important part of also building it into not just for this, but thinking about talking to my students, talking. I did a session for the MA at the beginning of the week, and so we use this space and we use what I was talking about making here as a way of talking to them about learning. The theme that we were looking at was learning. So because this is like a new piece of work, this is a new commission. I'll turn this way. Ooh. Can you see that? Okay, so you can see that is a drone shot of a site which is an abandoned golf course in Thamesmead. It's been abandoned for about 10 years. And the commission, I use curators, one of multiple ways for finding these kinds of places. I use a site called Curator Space. People put up proposals, people offer funding, galleries, et cetera, and this is Gallery number 32's project, and I'm working through the idea of putting a performance piece on this driving range, an abandoned driving range. So I talk about research in my teaching, and my teaching helps me think about my making. So they're not really separate. Hello, John. They're not really separate. Does that make no sense or some sense?
It does make sense. Can you? I'm just interested. Obviously, whenever we are within the social sciences, whenever we are trying to educate our doctoral students or doctoral researchers, we're trying to say, well, you need a research question.
Yeah.
So this is where that link between practice and research is made, that you're doing the practice, but you're doing that with a research question in mind. Whereas our definition of just practice, and I'm hyphenating or putting just into quotation mark, because obviously practice is very valuable in itself. But if it's only practice on its own, then you don't necessarily need a research question. Is that true for your practice as well?
It's interesting. I don't always start with a kind of a question, because if I go with the idea of a question, then it makes out that I'm looking for an answer. And that's a bit scientific and a bit sort of logical. And I don't work in that kind of way. So I think artists bring other ways of engaging. So that's why I use the idea of inquiry, because it may be something that I'm interested in, and I might not know what the questions are. But by engaging with these things, by exploring them, by kind of you reflect as you go along, you work and make, and as you work and make, you reflect and develop in practice, and you reflect in practice on that practice. And I think that's how it sort of generates, not necessarily a research question, but that's how it generates research. You might refrain, you might, narrow down, and you may feel that you've come to some sort of, maybe, I don't know, not necessarily a conclusion, but you come to a stop. Sometimes I get bored and I just stop because I'm bored, or I feel frustrated, and then I have to work on something else. So I might work on multiple things. So there's multiple things going on in this space with this work. And I think they feed each other and they talk to each other, and you have kind of multiple engagements with things that come to some sort of relationship. I wouldn't say they sit necessarily that comfortably sometimes, but they do relate to each other. If that kind of helps with, that sort of tricky question. I don't know if that kind of makes much more sense. A lot of this work is about failing. A lot of this process. So that's why I don't think I have answers. A lot of what I do, for instance, this piece is hands catching perception. Is all about trying to think about when I make, and when I make, constantly going back to something, constantly engaging with something, constantly missing it, or getting close to what I'm trying to do, or then literally, as I say, failing. But I've kind of used that really lovely Beckett quote of try again, fail better. And the way I've written that's really nice, because I've kind of I've spent a lot of time in Japan, so I've got this kind of really obsessive nature about how they use text in images and in their work. So I kind of like the way of writing that try again, fail better. You can read it left to right as try, fail, again, better, as well as sort of in the sort of top to bottom, you can go left to right. So I think failing and risk taking is important. Yeah. Do you want to go to this one?
It looks like everybody's still here, so I do apologize, everyone. It looks like everyone is still on here, but I have dropped off. So we've got a comment here from someone. Thanks for sharing the work. What are your thoughts on the move from practice as research towards the practice research level, where you're dropping the as essentially? I started to make work in practice as research times, and now the current term seems to be practice research. Is that meaningful? Is there something behind there, in your opinion?
So one of the things I think is important to say is I'm dyslexic, and I play with language, and actually I get very different interpretations and understandings of language as a consequence. So I play with language in my work a lot. I play with the multiple meanings of. So sometimes I'm not that obsessed with logocentric understandings and notions about language. I use a visual language. I get what you're saying. I don't worry about it. I know that sounds a bit arrogant. I don't care. I'm kind of interested in trying to articulate things visually and not worrying too much about those kinds of titles. I know that's not perhaps the good thing to say in this forum, but that's how I feel about it. I don't mind.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Can I just say that, that I always obviously also work in this space, and anyone who may have looked at the slides may have seen that I'm using practice as research with as a capitalized A. And for me, that's quite important, because practice research and practice as research, like you have typed it there with a non-capital A, is very much the prerogative, I find, for the creative arts or the performing arts. Whereas I'm trying to say, actually, there are other disciplines that are doing this kind of work as well. So I'm kind of trying to say, well, to include them, I'm using this capital A. So I'm saying, well, we're doing similar things, but I'm not trying to appropriate it.
Totally. No, I understand. And I think that's really important. I'm a big fan of making sure that this is one of the reasons why I struggle with labels, because the moment you kind of define and label, then it's become something, and then it's restricted, and then you can't necessarily step outside of it. So I'm not really a very black and white person. I like grey. I like the areas in between. I'm more interested in sort of those more fluid aspects rather than the borders of things. So I get it, but it's not something that necessarily is something I worry too much about.
I know, which is where we had that conversation before, where you said, "Oh, I'm not sure that you want me to be part of this seminar series because I'm going to say things that you're not going to like." And it's like, actually, no, this is exactly what I'm trying to do. Is I'm trying to say that we're all doing something like that. Let's come together from different disciplines. And yes, the art is great, but not everybody is an artist. So, there may be somebody who's a counsellor or who's a nursing educator. And they also do practice research in that kind of space, but in a different way. So where are the things that we can learn from one another?
I mean, on a simple level, I think embracing the practice as opposed to being quite anxious about practice. I remember oddly, I was employed, or I've always been employed as an artist. So one of the criteria in any of the roles in academia, and I've worked in 4 Russell Group institutions, the criteria has always been that you're an artist. Yet there's a tension when you're in somewhere that's academic. There's a tension in that they want to, they expect research to be in a kind of social science kind of format. They expect it to be written. They expect it to be, as I say, logocentric. And yet they employ a visual artist to be in those fields. So there's always a tension. There's always a kind of an issue. So I would, simply just say one just needs to feel secure in your practice, whatever that might be, to have, to embrace it, as opposed to be quite anxious by the fact that institutionally or hierarchically, it may not be seen in the same way in your institutions. So thankfully, people are changing their institutions are changing their perspective on these things. Thankfully, the ref is more embracing of these things. Thankfully, management is starting to realise now. So I'm quite positive about this. I suppose it's just sort of feeling positive about it is the key for maybe people that are not secure in some of these spaces. Does that make sense?
Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. So there's two questions there. One is, do you have any tips for scientists who want to collaborate with artists?
Oh, absolutely. I love collaborating with artists. I find scientists fascinating, and every scientist I've ever worked with has kind of moved as we've engaged. There's a commonality in many areas of art and science, whether it's the language, whether it's some of the processes. And so we just look at it from different positions and different perspectives. And I found that really intriguing. And they found it intriguing. One of the other ways of working is I have an alter ego. I have an alter ego as a scientist. I don't have a name. I just call myself Andy the Scientist. That just putting yourself in that space, being in a different space, I have found really, really rewarding and really thought-provoking. So on a simple level, I know that UCL runs out of their culture department, and I imagine a number of institutions do the same thing, but we run a number of projects called, one of them that I think is really lovely, called Trellis, where it tries to put an academic, and in this case, most of them tend to be scientists or architects or people that are working in these kinds of fields, with a local artist, with somebody. So a lot of this is out at UCL East. So artists out in the local community, in the East End, in Bow Arts, for instance, has worked with some of these scientists. There's some really lovely projects and really lovely examples of where funding can be found to support these kind of collaborations, these sorts of themes. And I know, for instance, one of the ones that I thought was really lovely with Trellis is we've had artists work with architects and engineers on a new build at UCL, and that was funded and sort of open to the general public. We've had artists work in an environmental sort of aspects on some of our sort of projects. So yeah, I would, if you're interested in it as a scientist, I'm sure there are other institutions other than ourselves that are trying to link up and collaborate and fund these sorts of moments. Does that kind of make sense?
If I pitch in here, a couple of sort of other points in addition to what Andy was just saying. I think one tip that I would give, as as part of what Andy was saying about the Trellis project as well, is to be open about what you think an artist is or looks like. Because on the Trellis project, for example, there would have been a jewellery maker who is there. Now, obviously, traditionally, when you think about an artist, it's somebody who's painting, drawing, maybe an installation. But, not many people would think of a jewellery maker as somebody who's an artist.
Absolutely.
And clearly they are artists as well. So I think being open about your definition of what artists constitute is one thing. And the other thing I would think that's really important when you collaborate with artists, pay them.
Yeah.
A lot of the times, it's a case of, well, you get the exposure, but quite frankly, exposure doesn't pay any bills, it doesn't pay any mortgage. Yeah. So it's not fair on the artist to require of them that they do their work and they're doing that unpaid. So I would suggest that's two things that are really important when you do want to collaborate.
And I know that if this is a question from a science academic, I know that the Wellcome Trust offer each year really large sums to enable these kinds of collaborations. The Wellcome Trust I've worked with in the past, and they're really keen to obviously get medical science and with artists to think about common ground. So I've worked with them on things like the brain and consciousness and senses, and sort of having those kinds of dialogues across disciplines has been funded by the Wellcome Trust. So I'd certainly look for those kinds of institutions as well.
So it's interesting. It seems to have struck a chord that I said, you know, pay the artists.
Oh God, please do pay the artists. Yes.
Andy, you quote Beckett. He suggested dance first, think later. Oh, dance first, think later.
Yeah.
How does research fold into the practice? What's the shape of this?
Yeah. I'm the same. I make, so I wouldn't necessarily advocate dance because I think I've got two left feet. But I would, in the performance, I think there is this kind of need to be active, to do, to make. I think as one is, constantly recording this making, it grows. You then have to spend time sifting, critiquing, analyzing, ordering, and something that another aspect that I think is really important is imagining, sort of dreaming and adding other kind of aspects rather than just the cold scientific logical aspects. But there is a almost like a whole series. I think if I'd had time, I kind of would have talked a little bit more about that sort of in the process. But I don't know if that kind of helps with that. That's a long-winded answer to that question.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. So I just said to, by the way, everybody, I've just said to Andy to bring the camera back so that you can see him again, because I'm going to begin to wrap this up slowly.
Sure.
I really, really appreciate that you've given us a little bit of an insight into your work. It's really exciting. And can I just say, I'm not sure how well you could see that, but on the side there, above the screen with the hand, there is a little snippet, like a piece of paper, which I really want to point out, because it says, try again, fail again, fail better. And I think this is because you said that's something at the beginning, you introduced that failing is a big part of your work. Yeah. And I think that encapsulates that really, really well. So yeah, thank you very much. Everybody else, we do have another practices seminar series session happening in February. I will make the links available. It's already out there. So this is going to be about sonic postcards, which is quite different from what we're doing today. And it will be an exciting presentation from two colleagues that are talking about their sonic postcards. Liz Griffin and George Revel, who are presenting on that. With that, I would like to say thank you very, very much, Andy, for your time, for sharing your work. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And yeah, if there's any other questions or comments, please do keep them coming.